But first, let's get the music in. There it is. First, let's talk a bit about this game down here. Look at that box art, by the way. That's amazing. Let's talk a bit about one of my favorite Final Fantasies, one of my favorite games, period. Which is Final Fantasy III. Obviously we're talking about Final Fantasy III, the real Final Fantasy III, not Final Fantasy VI, which was renamed Final Fantasy III in the US. We kind of touched on that when we talked about Final Fantasy II last time. This game, man. Final Fantasy III, for me, feels like one of the most forgotten Final Fantasies. It's one of the ones that I rarely see people talk about online. And not even that. I think it has the least re-releases of any Final Fantasy game. That's not like... That didn't came out like a couple of years ago. Like from the older games, I think it has the least re-releases. Maybe tied with Final Fantasy V, that also doesn't have a lot of them. But Final Fantasy III was released on the Famicom in 1990. A year that I'm partial to. It's my birth year. And the first time it was released in the West was the 3D remake on the Nintendo DS. I think in 2006. So there's a 16-year gap. Not just before it came to the West, but there's also the first re-release in Japan itself. And I think that's the longest gap any retro Final Fantasy has between original release and first re-release. The first time that the game proper was re-released in its 2D form was, I think, for the Wii Virtual Console, like in 2008 or 2009. And I think that was the first time you could play the 2D version in the West, for real. Unless, obviously, you count emulation, and there's a really, really good fan translation of the original Famicom version, which is what I played and what I play, because this is the Final Fantasy game that I've replayed the most. Maybe 6. I don't know. They kind of rival each other. But yeah, that's like the overview of Final Fantasy III. It came out very late in the Famicom's life cycle, but that also means that they kind of knew what they were doing from a technical perspective, which we'll talk about in a bit. And again, it's one of the ones that I see people talk about the least online, but it is right now, 1 through 7, my second favorite, right after Final Fantasy VI. And it's the one that I feel the most passionate about, I feel. I played it as part of my journey to play through the Final Fantasy games. I played it alone. And I think mid-2019. Could be wrong about that, but somewhere in the ballpark. And then when I started streaming again, I played it again. I already knew I loved it, and I was loving it even more when I streamed it. Let's go into the meat of things, but before, again, obviously, this is an unscripted review, so I don't really have... I don't want to limit myself talking about certain things. I don't trust myself to only contain spoilers to a separate section, so this is why I'm giving a general spoiler warning at the beginning of the review. Anything beyond this could contain spoilers. I highly recommend you play the game if you haven't, and I actually highly recommend you play the original Famicom version with a fan translation if you can get it, rather than the 3D remake for the DS. Obviously, there's a pixel remaster. Highly recommend any of these versions, but I prefer the original Famicom versions for reasons that I will get into. Final Fantasy III is the last out of the Final Fantasy games that, at least originally, they changed this in the DS remake, but in the original Famicom version, the characters don't have names. Your party members, they don't have names, they don't have like character traits really. You name them, you start your adventure, you have your own party. And this is like Final Fantasy I had the same thing, Final Fantasy II to a degree. And Final Fantasy III feels like the apex of what I will call like the classic Final Fantasy games that are really at their core about going out there and having an adventure, having a fantasy adventure. And that's what this game does meticulously, in my opinion. This really feels, especially when you name the party members after your friends, which I love to do, this feels like going on an adventure with your friends. And compared to Final Fantasy I, it feels like a grander adventure, at least to me. There's not a lot of startup, you just get thrown right in, but every single step of the way the game expands when it comes to mechanics, when it comes to things you can do, and when it comes to the world itself. Final Fantasy III also, at least for me, has a very cool story. Like, story I feel like wasn't really the strong suit of the Final Fantasy games until like 6, to be completely honest. 4 or 5 are kind of fine. But 3, while not being like a complex story, it's a very classic feeling story, and it definitely adds to the vibe of the game. We have elemental crystals again, but this time we have 4 light and 4 dark crystals, and you have the idea of light and darkness having to be kept in balance, not one overpowering the other, to keep the world in check and keep it like spinning. And in the past, there was actually a time when the light side got too strong, so there were 4 dark warriors chosen that like put the light side and the light crystals back in their place to maintain the order of things. And now, several hundred years later, it's our turn as the light warriors to do the same when the dark side is getting so strong. We have the main antagonist, Zand, which comes into play really late, but you hear kind of about him from time to time. And he was like a student of a great sage, and the great sage had 3 students, one of them Zand, and he gave each of them a specific power. And Zand, he gave the power of being a human, being mortal. And he didn't like that, as you tend to do, because that sounds kind of lame. But while he thinks it's a lame gift to him, the gift of mortality and actually experiencing things, valuing them that much more, knowing you have limited time, is actually thought to be like a really thoughtful gift. And the other 2 students, whose name I currently forgotten. One is named Un, which is like the dream. She got the realm of dreams. The other 2 students actually envy Zand, kinda, because they thought he got the best gift. But yeah, Zand now uses the dark crystals to bring the world out of order. Final Fantasy III kinda tries to do what Final Fantasy II did, and give you characters that join your party, like to make up for your characters lacking in character traits, I guess. And they give you a multitude of different characters that are around for like a few hours, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer. These include Sid, who looks adorable in this game, Dash, who's like a rogue with a love backstory, a Kid King, and several others. These don't participate in combat, which is different than Final Fantasy II because your party is already full. You start with 4 people, you end with 4 people, the same 4 people. You don't get thrown out of the party in the first battle and then come back 40 hours later in the last dungeon. Thank you, Final Fantasy II. We would love that. It's rather that you have them with you, they follow you around. They're central to like the local plot that you experience in some areas. And you can interact with them, you can like talk with them. And it adds like a neat little thing. You start on this like in your village. You're like 4 kids or teenagers. I don't know how old you are supposed to be. And I think the idea is basically you take the armor and weapons of like your parents or of your foster parents, and you want to have an adventure. And because of everything, like the armor is too big for you, this is why your first job is described as Onion Knight, because it kind of looked like an onion with like the way too big helmet on. And also the sprite's adorable for the Onion Knights. You fall in the cave, you fight some enemies, and then you encounter the first crystal. And the crystal's light is fading, and it gives you the greatest gift of all. Employment. Yeah, they give you jobs. Jobs is what this game calls classes. And later on, you get more classes, more jobs. You expand your world. You actually find out you're living on a very isolated floating continent, and you leave and have this wide overworld and are hellbent on getting all the crystals, getting the energy from all the light crystals, and then stopping Zant once and for all. The jobs are the key word in this game. This is the game that introduced the job system, which has become something of a staple in the Final Fantasies series. It's not like super common, but there are multiple games that use it. Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy Tactics are probably the best examples, but also I think Final Fantasy XII, at least the Zodiac Age, uses a job system. And Final Fantasy XIV, of course, uses a job system. But Final Fantasy III is where it started. Where Final Fantasy II went fucking insanely off the rails when it comes to gameplay. Ditching leveling, ditching classes, ditching everything. Final Fantasy III kinda brought it back to where Final Fantasy I was. With like classic, getting experience, getting level ups. But you don't have fixed classes anymore. You get jobs from the crystals, so you unlock the jobs over like several hours of gameplay, and you can switch jobs. And a job that your character has decides what equipment you can use, what abilities you have, and also what stats you get while leveling up. Like when you're a black mage, for example, you get way more intelligence at a level up than a warrior. But you probably get less HP per level up. And so, while we don't have the more complicated intermingling between jobs that we get in Final Fantasy V, we still have the idea of, oh, maybe I want to switch to a job that gives me more HP per level up for a couple of level ups. Even though I don't want to use this job long term, but I want this character to have more HP than he's getting with his current job. And of course you get like multiple, like, it's fun to see what jobs you get at the next crystal. There are, I think, over 20 jobs in this game, which makes for a lot of fun when it comes to party customization. This is, in my opinion, one of the best features of the game. Just thinking about, oh, what party customization can I do in the next playthrough? What jobs haven't I really used? Some are jobs upgrades of previous ones, like there's a shaman or devout, I think it's called, in some versions, which is just an upgraded white mage. And there's one for the black mage as well. But there are a lot of like unique jobs, and some that you get from the very first crystal don't really become obsolete through the entire game, which I love. You get a currency, like pretty much a second set of experience points, and you actually level your jobs as well, making them more proficient. This basically means like their equipment use gets upped. If you're a warrior and you get more warrior levels, you can use like melee weapons better. If you get black mage level ups, you get more spell charges, because we're back to spell charges now, not mana. But yeah, this is like where the way the customization really gets going. And it's fun to experiment. There are a lot of cool jobs that you can use. Sadly, at least when it comes to the Famicom version, some jobs aren't that great. Like, they weren't balanced really well. And the customization aspect gets kind of thrown out some parts of the game, but not a lot. When you get, like, in specific areas, you really need specific jobs. There are a few dungeons where you have to be mini. And mini means you pretty much don't do no physical damage. So you pretty much need every single character to be a magic class for that. There's a Garuda boss fight where you pretty much need every single character to be a dragoon. And that's kind of like problematic because it throws a wrench in the idea of party customization when you're pretty much forced in certain area to use certain jobs. And it's something that they didn't revisit for Final Fantasy V. They really learned how to balance the jobs more. I think that's something that's alleviated in the 3D remake, but I'm not actually entirely sure how much better it really is. But I know there are a lot of balancing changes when it comes to the jobs themselves. You progress through the game. You have multiple optional things, especially later on in the game when you get the last 2 airships. The Nautilus that can dive, so you actually have like an undersea world, and the Invincible, which can fly over mountain ranges. And you can unlock summons, for example. You can access Leviathan, you can access Bahamut, you can access Odin late in the game and acquire them, because this is also the game that introduced summoners, which is also a mainstay, and summons in general, in Final Fantasy now. You have an Evoker class, and you have a Summoner class, and Summoners even already had the Unicorn Horn, which is like their most well-known visual traits. You get summons, a lot of the classic summons. You also get Moogles for the first time in this game. You get the fat Chocobo. Chocobos were introduced in Final Fantasy II, but the fat Chocobo came in Final Fantasy III for the first time. So a lot of things that came into the series here at the first time. Something that also came here in the first time is that the boss, the evil villain, is not actually the evil villain. It's a stupid trait. It's one of my least favorite parts of this game, and it's something that they would revisit in Final Fantasy IV. And I think in Final Fantasy V, not really, but in Final Fantasy IV, and it's something that is continuously brought up in the series. Like the actual end boss, which is called Cloud of Darkness, it's just like an evil entity that wants to destroy the world, and it shows up for the final fight. It's never referenced before, and it's annoying. But yeah. One downside of the job system, and it's something that a lot of job systems, like games that have class customization, have, that I absolutely dislike. A current example is Metaphor. Fantastic game, but it does the same thing. Super jobs. Final Fantasy III has 2 super jobs, Ninja and Sage. And except for self-restraint, there's no reason not to have 2 ninjas and 2 sages in the last as your main party once you get those jobs. And that's annoying to me. if you give me this cool system to customize my party, please don't just give me like objectively the best jobs at some point. I dislike that a lot. Metaphor does the same thing. And it was that was something that really soured my experience with both games. But other than that, gameplay-wise, I really enjoy this game because it feeds into this like adventure, going on an adventure theme that I love so much. This game is also, when it comes to graphics and music, it's amazing. Obviously, it's 8-bit, but because it's so late in the Famicom life cycle, they really like mastered how to like approach the technical limitations. The music, we've been hearing it for like 20 minutes now. It's amazing. It's so varied, even though the channel limitations of the Famicom are still there. But Nobuo Uematsu, I think this is one of his finest works, working with the limitations of the system, but still delivering such a varied, interesting, and very orchestral soundtrack. Some of these songs are legitimately amazing, and there are obviously like full orchestral versions of these online, and they are wonderful because the bass version that was in this game is already so great. Especially the overworld theme for the floating continent is one of the best pieces of video game music that I personally know. The graphics, the sprite work in this game is amazing for the time, especially. Enemies, even non-bosses, are really big a lot of the time, so they are really detailed. And because they are so much bigger than your party members, they do feel really oppressive and opposing. And the bosses especially. They're also really varied. They're really fucked up sometimes, which I love. Like some of the first enemies that you find are like rocks with eyes. And they're disturbing. They're not like your usual goblins and stuff and wolves. They're like weird. In an almost Lovecraftian sense. Something that I have to talk a little bit, like tangent, I have to talk a little bit about the Pixel Remaster, because Pixel Remaster is probably the easiest way to play this game nowadays. I think it looks worse than the OG Famicom version. Mainly because the sprite work was already amazing, and you have a wider screen. Obviously, you have a wide screen with the Pixel Remasters, which means that you have a lot more space that in battle is not being filled, which makes it look empty and makes the sprites look more lost. And also, you have like completely filled in backgrounds in the battles, and I actually really dislike this. The black background, that was a limitation of the Famicom. It really makes these sprites pop, and you can really like almost tangible feel the outlines. But over like a brick floor or something, or like a grassy wooden floor, they just get lost. And my biggest pet peeve, and please, every video game designer out there, I beg you so much, if you make a pixelated game, do not make the font smooth. It looks cheap. It looks terrible. The Pixel Remasters do this. It immediately looks like a mobile game. Really pay attention to it if you see like screenshots from this, or you see any other type. Like Square Enix is notorious for doing this. It looks bad. Make a pixelated font, please. It just it just matches the style. It bugs the hell out of me. It really does. Other than that, obviously the Pixel Remaster is a fantastic way to play the game nowadays. The 3D remake has a lot of fans, and I think it's also a great way to play the game. I personally just hope to give an insight into why you should maybe also try the original version, and not always just think that or because the other real releases are newer, they are automatically better. Because I personally don't think that. And I mean, my freaking Blue Sky description, my profile description has #1 Final Fantasy III Defender in it. And there's a reason for it. I love this game. It has flaws, like some jobs just being not viable. Looking at you, Scholar. Such a nice sprite, but it's just so unnecessary. You can't really use it. Some areas forcing you to use certain jobs, having super jobs. And of course, the most notorious thing, which is that when you progress through the game, like normally, it's pretty good, it's pretty smooth, it has some challenging aspects, but mainly you go around pretty well without grinding. And then you come to the last dungeon, you're pretty much 20 levels too low. There's an insane difficulty spike. And while I still say that Final Fantasy II is the most difficult out of the first 3 Final Fantasies, overall, the Crystal Tower, the last dungeon of Final Fantasy III, is easy the most difficult part of all of the 3 games. It's just insanely well above the difficulty of the rest of the game. It's very long. And because it's a Famicom game, like in the Famicom games, there were no safe spots in dungeons. You couldn't save in dungeons, like at all. And the Crystal Towers, like, you could easily spend 4 hours in that dungeon and then die to the last boss and having to do 4 hours again. If you're an emulator, honestly, just save state. Why wouldn't you? Like, there are a lot of difficult fights in that. But still, this game gives you the feeling of going on an adventure with your friends. A really well-constructed fantasy world that opens up more and more and surprises you with its design. When you first leave the floating continent and you see the rest of the overworld in comparison to what you've been experiencing so far, and you already thought that what you were experiencing so far was a pretty big world, and it just opens up, that's a magical feeling. And I highly encourage you to see that for yourself. Do yourself a favor. Get out of your comfort zone a little bit. Try the original Famicom version. The fan translation is excellent, and you can easily find it online. And it has enough quality of life, like compared to Final Fantasy 1 and 2, to be playable, even by today's standards. Just bask in the wonderful sprite work and the great music for the time. I love this game. Despite all its flaws, this is my special Final Fantasy game. It's not my favorite. It's not even the best. I know this. I know it's not my favorite. I know it's not the best out of the ones that I've played. But it's mine. So I'm claiming it. Oh man. Such a wonderful game. And it will probably always be... I can't speak for the ones that come, because I haven't played them yet. But out of the first 7 at least, this will definitely be my most played. Because this is a comfort game for me. And it's not that long. Like compared, especially with like 7. Yeah. I'm trying to get the word more out there because this is so many people talk about their favorite Final Fantasy games, and it's rarely 3. So I feel like I have to push it a little extra because it's that's my second favorite still. But the wonderful music. And I mean, compared to Final Fantasy 2, we ran all the way through the Final Fantasy II soundtrack last time, and the review was shorter, like a few minutes. And here we already have we still have like 18 tracks to go. There's so much music in this game. Wonderful game. Just play it.